Pick any wife for free, the judge laughed, and the whole town roared. But when a grieving rancher stepped forward and said, "I'll take the obese Amish girl," the laughter died in the dust. No one expected him to choose her, not in a town that lived on cruelty. She was mocked, shamed, cast out of her own people. He was a man drowning in loss, with a ranch on the edge of ruin. Together, they walked out of that courthouse into a storm neither of them saw coming, because what began as a cruel joke turned into a fight for survival. The railroad is moving in, hungry for land and water. Old treaties are stirring, and secrets long buried are about to change everything. In the quiet of her prayers and the strength of his hands, a new family is being forged, while powerful men plot to tear it apart. Will mercy and faith be strong enough to stand against greed and mockery? Or will the land, and their hearts, be lost forever? Every time I see your comments, I'm reminded how stories connect us across distances, backgrounds, and hearts. If values like respect, courage, and compassion still guide you, then you're part of this story too. The late afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the courthouse square of San Miguel, turning the packed dirt into choking dust that clung to boots and hems. The townsfolk had gathered for what Judge Horace Braddock called his wife raffle, though it was less a raffle than a cruel spectacle meant to shame those who couldn't pay their debts. Judge Braddock stood on the courthouse steps, his black coat collecting dust as he gestured broadly to the crowd. "Step right up, gentlemen. Take your pick of these fine ladies. Free of charge." His voice carried the false cheer of a carnival barker, but his eyes held something harder. "Clear your debts by claiming a bride. Surely some lonely soul needs a helpmate?" The crowd shifted restlessly, more interested in the entertainment than any real intention to marry. Working men in dusty clothes stood shoulder to shoulder with merchants in their Sunday best, all waiting to see who would be brought forward next. Abby Yoder kept her eyes fixed on her worn boots as she stepped into the circle. Her plain black dress and white prayer cap marked her as clearly as a brand, an outsider, an Amish woman far from her Pennsylvania home. She clasped her hands tightly, moving her lips in silent prayer even as the first jeers started. "Look at the size of her," someone called out. "Might need 2 husbands to handle that much woman." Laughter rippled through the crowd. Abby's cheeks burned, but she didn't raise her eyes. She'd weathered mockery before, back in her community when she'd refused to marry Elder Zook. Their cruel words had driven her west, but they hadn't broken her faith. She prayed now for strength, for dignity, for God's will to be done. Judge Braddock's voice cut through the laughter. "Come now, surely someone wants a fine Amish wife. Think of the cooking, the sewing, He paused for effect. Other domestic talents." More laughter, cruder now. Abby felt each jeer like a physical blow, but she stood straight. Her mama had taught her that. Stand straight, keep your dignity, trust in the Lord's plan. The crowd's amusement reached its peak when a tall figure stepped forward. The laughter didn't die immediately. It took a moment for people to realize this wasn't another mocker, but someone serious. Luis Boone moved with the careful grace of a man used to handling spooked horses. His broad shoulders were set square, his weather-lined face solemn beneath his dust-colored hat. "I'll take the obese Amish girl," he said, his voice quiet but carrying clearly across the suddenly hushed square. Judge Braddock's smile faltered for just a moment. "Well now, Mr. Boone, didn't expect to see you here today. You sure about this? Plenty of other—" "I'm sure." Luis's words weren't loud, but they had the weight of iron. He stepped closer to Abby, and for the first time she looked up. His eyes met hers, dark and steady. There was no mockery there, no cruel amusement. Instead, she saw something that made her breath catch. Respect. Simple, human respect. A few people were still laughing, but it was uncertain now. Luis Boone wasn't a man people laughed at easily. He was known throughout the county as a fair man, a hard worker, someone who paid his debts and kept his word. The sight of him standing there, treating this moment with dignity, turned the mockery sour in many throats. Luis held out his hand to Abby. His fingers were calloused from ranch work, but his touch was gentle as she placed her hand in his. "Ma'am," he said, tipping his hat to her like she was any proper lady. The simple courtesy brought tears to Abby's eyes, but she blinked them back. She'd learned long ago not to show weakness to those who would use it against her. Judge Braddock cleared his throat. Well then, if you're certain. He shuffled through some papers, obviously disappointed that his entertainment had taken an unexpected turn. The lady's debts are cleared by your claim, Mr. Boone. She's your responsibility now. Much obliged, Judge. Luis's tone was perfectly polite, but something in it made the judge step back slightly. Without another word, Luis guided Abby down the courthouse steps. The crowd parted for them, their earlier merriment fading in the face of Luis's quiet dignity. A few people nodded to him, touching their hats in awkward respect. Others looked away, suddenly shamefaced at their part in the mockery. The late afternoon sun was softening now, painting the dusty street in shades of gold and amber. Luis led Abby to where his wagon waited, a solid farm wagon with a team of steady bay horses. Everything about it spoke of careful maintenance and honest work. "If you'll allow me, ma'am," Luis said, offering his hand to help her up to the seat. His manner was courteous, but not overly familiar, giving her the space to make her own choice. Abby took his hand, grateful for the support as she climbed up. The wagon seat was worn smooth with use, but clean and solid. Luis checked that she was settled before walking around to take his place beside her. The horses moved forward at his gentle command, their hooves raising small puffs of dust. The town began to fall away behind them, the sounds of the crowd fading into the evening quiet. Abby sat straight, her hands folded in her lap, stealing glances at the man beside her. Luis kept his eyes on the road, handling the reins with practiced ease. The silence between them wasn't exactly comfortable, but neither was it hostile. It was a waiting silence, full of questions unasked and stories untold. The wagon wheels creaked a steady rhythm as they headed out of town. To the west, the mountains rose against the darkening sky, their peaks touched with the last of the sun's gold. Abby had never seen mountains like these in Pennsylvania. They made her feel small, but not in the cruel way the crowd's mockery had. This was the smallness of standing before God's creation, a humbling that lifted the spirit instead of crushing it. A cool breeze stirred, carrying the scent of sage and distant rain. Abby drew a deep breath, tasting freedom in the air. Whatever came next, she was no longer standing in that circle of jeering faces. The Lord had sent her a defender, though not in any way she might have expected. Luis cleared his throat softly. "My ranch is about 10 miles out," he said, his voice grave but kind. "It's not much to look at, but it's good land. Clean water from the creek year-round, and the grazing's fair." "Thank you," Abby said, her voice barely above a whisper. Then, gathering her courage, she added, "Not just for the information, Mr. Boone. For everything." He nodded, acknowledging both her thanks and the deeper meaning behind it. "Luis," he said after a moment. "My name's Luis." "I'm Abby," she replied. "Abby Yoder." The wagon rolled on through the gathering dusk. Behind them, the town's lights began to twinkle on, but Abby didn't look back. Her life had changed in a moment, turned on its head by a quiet act of mercy. She didn't know what lay ahead, but she knew one thing for certain: God had answered her prayers, though not in any way she could have imagined. The road wound through scattered pinyon pines and patches of scrub oak, climbing gradually toward the foothills. The horses maintained their steady pace, and Luis handled them with the sure touch of long experience. Everything about him spoke of patience and capability, from the way he held the reins to how he guided the wagon around rough spots in the road. As the last light faded from the sky, the first stars began to appear. Abby watched them emerge, remembering how her mother used to say that stars were God's way of reminding us that light always returns, even in the darkest times. Today had brought both darkness and light, mockery and mercy. Now, heading toward an unknown future with this quiet, dignified stranger, Abby felt something she hadn't expected: hope. The wagon wheels creaked a steady rhythm as they left San Miguel behind. Dust rose in gentle clouds around the horses' hooves, settling on Abby's plain black dress and Luis's worn leather boots. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the trail, and a warm breeze carried the scent of sage and summer-dried grass. Luis held the reins loosely, his practiced hands guiding the team with subtle movements. He didn't press Abby to speak, seeming to understand her need for silence after the courthouse spectacle. The only sounds were the jingling of harness, the soft swish of the horses' tails, and the occasional call of a meadowlark in the distance. Abby kept her hands folded in her lap, stealing careful glances at her unexpected protector. Luis's face remained focused on the trail ahead, his expression thoughtful beneath the brim of his dust-colored hat. The silence between them wasn't exactly comfortable, but it held no threat either. After about an hour's travel, Luis guided the wagon off the main trail toward a creek that curved through a stand of cottonwoods. The horse's ears pricked forward at the sound of running water. "Need to water the team," Luis said, his voice gentle but matter-of-fact. He set the brake and stepped down, moving to the horses' heads to begin unhitching them. Abby remained seated, watching as he led the animals to drink. His movements were sure and efficient, speaking of years of experience. When the horses were settled at the creek's edge, Luis returned to the wagon. He leaned against the wheel, looking up at her with those steady, dark eyes. "Reckon you deserve to know why I spoke up back there," he said quietly. "My wife, Sarah, she passed last winter. Fever took her quick, before the doctor could make it through the snow." He paused, pain flickering across his weathered features. "The place has gone downhill since then. I can handle the cattle and the land, but the house..." He shook his head. "I need help, plain and simple. And I couldn't stand by and watch them shame you like that." Abby's hands tightened in her lap. "I have nowhere else to go," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "My community in Pennsylvania. They cast me out when I refused to marry Elder Stoltzfus." She swallowed hard. "He was a cruel man. I couldn't..." "You don't need to explain," Luis interrupted gently. "What's past is past. I'm offering you a fair chance, work and a roof over your head. Nothing more, nothing less." Relief washed through Abby at his words. This wasn't a rescue meant to trap her in another impossible situation. It was simply one person offering another a chance at dignity. The rest of the journey passed quietly as the sun sank toward the western mountains. The land changed as they traveled, becoming more rugged, with scattered pine trees and rocky outcrops. When they finally crested a small rise, Luis's ranch lay before them in the gathering dusk. The house was a substantial log structure, though Abby could see it needed attention. The roof seemed sound, but the porch sagged slightly, and the windows looked grimy. A barn stood nearby, its red paint fading, and the fence around the corral showed signs of neglect. In the pasture beyond, cattle grazed on sparse grass, their ribs showing more than they should. Luis helped Abby down from the wagon, then led her to the house. The interior was clean but desperately in need of a woman's touch. Dust lay thick on the furniture, and the curtains hung limp and faded at the windows. The kitchen held a massive iron cookstove, its surface dulled with grease and ash. "Guest rooms this way," Luis said, leading her down a short hallway. He opened a door to reveal a simple room with a narrow bed, a chest of drawers, and a small window looking east toward the plains. "It's yours until you feel settled. There's a lock on the door if you want it." Abby nodded, touched by his consideration. "Thank you." "I'll bring your things in from the wagon," Luis said. "Then I'd best see to supper, unless you're too tired." "I can help," Abby offered, but Luis shook his head. "Rest a spell first, it's been a long day." When he returned with her modest carpet bag, Abby took a moment to freshen up, washing the dust from her face and hands in the basin he'd provided. The water was cool and clean, tasting of mountains. Supper was simple, beans and bread with coffee for Luis and water for Abby. Before eating, Abby folded her hands and bowed her head in prayer. Through lowered lashes, she saw surprise flicker across Luis's face, followed by something that might have been respect. He waited quietly until she finished. The meal passed in comfortable silence. The beans were plain but filling, and the bread, though slightly stale, was honest fare. Through the window, Abby watched darkness settle over the land, bringing with it the first stars of evening. When they finished eating, Luis rose to bank the fire in the stove. "Sleep well, Miss Yoder," he said quietly. "God willing, tomorrow will be easier than today." Abby made her way to the guest room, grateful for the solid door between her and the unknown. She changed into her nightdress and knelt beside the bed, offering up her evening prayers. The familiar words brought comfort, though everything else about her situation was strange and new. As she lay in the narrow bed, listening to the unfamiliar creaks and settling sounds of the house, a coyote's howl rose from somewhere in the darkness. Another answered, the wild voices weaving together in an ancient song of loneliness and survival. Abby pulled the quilt tighter around her shoulders. Everything about her life had changed in the space of a single day. The courthouse humiliation, Luis's unexpected intervention, this strange new home in the shadow of the mountains. It all seemed almost like a dream, but the rough texture of the homespun sheets against her skin was real enough, as was the solid roof over her head. Whatever tomorrow might bring, she was no longer standing in that circle of mockery. God had answered her prayers, though in a way she never could have imagined. As sleep finally began to settle over her, Abby whispered one last prayer of gratitude, not for rescue or romance, but for something far more precious, the chance to live with dignity. Outside, the coyotes sang their wild songs to the stars and the wind whispered through the pine trees. Inside, two lonely souls rested under the same roof, each carrying their own burdens of grief and uncertainty, each hoping for a better tomorrow. Luis lay awake in his own room, listening to the familiar night sounds of his ranch. The house felt different with another person under its roof. Not wrong, just different. He'd done what needed doing today, nothing more. Whether it would lead to healing for either of them, only time would tell. The night deepened and peace settled over the ranch. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for now, there was just the quiet darkness, the distant coyotes, and the first tentative beginnings of hope, taking root in two wounded hearts. Dawn crept through the kitchen window, painting golden squares on the worn floorboards. Abby stood at the sink, her hands already busy with morning tasks. She had risen before sunrise, her body trained by years of Amish discipline to welcome each new day early. The kitchen, though sturdy, showed signs of a man's neglect: grease-spotted walls, dusty windowsills, and cupboards in disarray. She found coffee beans in a tin and ground them carefully, the familiar motion bringing comfort. The wood stove responded well to her touch, and soon the kitchen filled with the rich aroma of brewing coffee. As she worked, she hummed an old hymn under her breath, taking stock of what needed attention first. Luis's bootsteps on the porch made her pause. He entered, then stopped short at the sight of her already at work. His expression shifted from surprise to something less readable. "Good morning," Abby said quietly, gesturing to the coffee pot. "I hope you don't mind that I started breakfast." "Mind?" Luis shook his head, removing his hat. "No, ma'am, I don't mind at all." He accepted the cup she offered, inhaling deeply. Been a while since this kitchen saw such care. They shared a simple breakfast of cornmeal mush which Abby had found in the pantry. When they finished, Luis cleared his throat. "Thought you might want to see the ranch, if you're feeling up to it. Best to know what you're getting into." Abby nodded, grateful for his directness. She tied on her bonnet, and they stepped out into the morning light. The air was crisp with early summer, carrying the scent of sage and pine from the surrounding hills. Luis led her first to the barn, its weathered boards solid despite the peeling paint. Inside, the morning sun filtered through gaps in the roof, illuminating dust motes and empty stalls. "Used to keep more horses," he explained, before Sarah passed. Had to sell some when things got tight. They moved on to the corrals where a few ranch horses dozed in the morning sun. Luis pointed out the different pastures, explaining the rotation of the cattle through the seasons. His voice grew concerned when they reached the creek that wound through the property. "Creek's been running lower each year," he said, crouching to touch the water. "Last winter was hard on the cattle, not enough hay stored, and the grass came late this spring. They're thinner than they should be." Abby studied the shallow water thoughtfully. "In Pennsylvania, we preserved everything we could. Maybe we could plant a kitchen garden, store more for winter?" Luis straightened, considering her words. "Sarah used to keep a garden," he said softly. "Haven't had the heart to tend it since." "I understand," Abby said gently. "But perhaps it's time to try again." They walked the rest of the property, Luis pointing out the boundaries and explaining the work that needed doing. Abby listened carefully, her practical mind already planning improvements. The ranch was worn, but not broken. Like its owner, it just needed care and attention to thrive again. Back in the kitchen, Abby rolled up her sleeves and began cleaning in earnest. She found supplies in a back closet, soap, rags, and an old broom. The work was familiar and satisfying. She swept years of dust from corners, scrubbed countertops, and organized cupboards. By midday, the kitchen already felt different, lighter somehow, more welcoming. She found flour and yeast in the pantry and set about making bread, the rhythm of kneading as natural as breathing. The dough rose in the warm kitchen while she continued cleaning, filling the house with the promise of fresh-baked sustenance. Luis came in from his work several times throughout the day, each time pausing at the transformation taking place. He said little, but Abby noticed his eyes taking in the changes: the gleaming window panes, the organized shelves, the bread cooling on the rack. As evening approached, Abby set out a simple supper of beans, fresh bread, and coffee. Luis washed up at the pump outside, then took his place at the table. He waited while she said her prayer, then broke the bread with careful hands. "Much obliged," he said after a few bites, his voice gruff with emotion. "Been a while since I sat down to fresh bread." "It's no trouble," Abby replied softly, pleased by his appreciation. "A house needs bread, like a garden needs rain." They ate in comfortable silence, the kitchen warm with lamplight and the lingering scent of baking. Abby felt a small spark of belonging take root in her heart. This place, for all its wear and loneliness, could become home. After the dishes were done and the kitchen set in order for morning, Abby heard the sound of hoofbeats in the yard. Through the window, she saw a rider dismounting, another rancher by his dress, though older than Luis. She was about to retire to her room when she heard their voices drift through the open window. The visitor's tone was urgent, concerned. "Railroad's filing claims all up and down the valley, Luis. Water rights, grazing rights. They're taking everything they can get their hands on." Luis's response was low, tight with tension. "They can't just take what's not theirs. They've got lawyers, Luis, papers and deeds we never knew existed. Thompson's place is already dry. They diverted his creek for the steam engines. Others will follow." Abby's heart tightened in her chest. She pressed a hand against the rough wall, steadying herself. The visitor's words painted a grim picture. Without water, the ranch would wither. The cattle would suffer. The garden she planned would never grow, and this fragile new beginning would crumble like dry earth. Through the window, she saw Luis's shoulders stiffen. "We'll fight them," he said firmly. "This land's been in my family 3 generations. I won't let them take it." "Just wanted to warn you," the neighbor replied, mounting his horse. "Meeting at Thompson's place tomorrow night. Reckon we all need to stand together on this." After the rider departed, Luis remained in the yard for a long while, staring at the darkening mountains. Abby watched him from the shadow of the kitchen, her prayer beads moving silently through her fingers. In just one day, this place had begun to feel like sanctuary. The thought of losing it to the railroad's greed made her chest ache. Finally, Luis turned and came inside. He paused in the kitchen doorway, taking in the gleaming surfaces and ordered space. For a moment, his expression softened, revealing a glimpse of the hope they both felt for this place. "Good night, Miss Yoder," he said quietly. "Thank you for your work today." Abby nodded, understanding that his thanks encompassed more than just the cleaning and cooking. "Good night, Mr. Boone. I'll be praying for the ranch." He touched his hat brim and withdrew, his bootsteps heavy on the stairs. Abby finished her evening tasks, then retired to her room. As she knelt for her prayers, she added a special petition for water to keep flowing, for strength to face whatever battles lay ahead, and for this fragile new home to somehow survive. The sun rose harsh and bright over the Colorado hills, promising another scorching summer day. Abby stood at the kitchen window, watching dust devils dance across the yard while she prepared a quick breakfast. Her hands trembled slightly as she worked. Today they would make their arrangement official before God and the townspeople. Luis came in from the barn, his shirt already showing sweat marks from the morning chores. He nodded to her, accepting a cup of coffee. "Wagon's hitched. We can leave after breakfast if you're ready." "Yes," Abby replied softly, smoothing her best dress. It was plain black as her faith required, but she had pressed it carefully the night before. "I am ready." They ate quickly, neither speaking much. The magnitude of what they were about to do seemed to fill the kitchen. When they finished, Luis helped her into the wagon with careful hands, then climbed up beside her. The horses set off at a steady pace toward San Miguel. The morning heat built as they traveled, making the air shimmer above the dusty road. Abby held her bonnet against the breeze, watching fence posts tick past. Besides them, occasional meadowlarks called from their perches, and a red-tailed hawk circled lazily overhead. "Might be some folk who don't understand," Luis said finally, breaking the long silence. "But what's between us and God is our business, not theirs." Abby nodded, touched by his concern. "I learned long ago not to let others' cruel words shake my faith. God sees our hearts." The church came into view as they crested a small rise, a simple white-painted building with a modest steeple. Several wagons and horses were already tied up outside. Luis helped Abby down, then offered his arm as they approached the steps. Inside, morning light streamed through plain glass windows, creating patterns on the wooden floor. A few early parishioners turned to stare as they entered. Abby heard the whispers start immediately, shocked murmurs about the strange pair they made. "Did you hear the rancher and that Amish girl? What could he be thinking? Like, poor Luis must be desperate indeed." Abby kept her eyes forward, though her cheeks burned. Luis's arm tensed under her hand, but he too ignored the whispers as they made their way to the pastor's study. Reverend Matthews greeted them with genuine warmth, his weathered face creasing in a smile. "Welcome, welcome. Come in, please." He ushered them into his small office, where morning sunlight made the dust motes dance. "The Lord brings people together in his own way," the pastor said kindly, noting their discomfort. "I'm glad to help make your union official." He took them through the necessary paperwork first, his pen scratching as he recorded their names and details in the church registry. Then he led them to the front of the sanctuary, where more townspeople had gathered, drawn by curiosity. The ceremony itself was brief but dignified. Reverend Matthews spoke of duty, respect, and building a life together in God's grace. When it came time for the vows, Abby's voice rang clear and steady through the church. "I, Abigail Yoder, take thee, Luis Boone." Luis spoke more quietly, but his grip on her hand was firm and respectful as he repeated the words. When the pastor pronounced them man and wife, a few polite claps echoed in the sanctuary, though Abby noticed several women whispering behind their hands. After signing the final documents, they stepped out into the harsh sunlight. Luis suggested they visit the general store for supplies while they were in town. Abby agreed, though her heart sank at the thought of facing more scrutiny. The bell above the store door jangled as they entered. Mrs. Peterson, the storekeeper's wife, was helping several other women with fabric selections. Their conversation died abruptly when Abby and Luis walked in. "Well, if it isn't the happy couple," one woman said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. The others tittered, casting sideways glances at Abby's plain dress and substantial figure. Abby lifted her chin and moved purposefully through the store, selecting flour, coffee, and other necessities. She could feel their eyes following her, hear their poorly concealed snickers, but she focused on her task. Luis worked silently beside her, his jaw tight with suppressed anger at their cruelty. Mrs. Peterson at least maintained a professional manner as she totaled their purchases. "Will that be all today, Mr. Boone?" "Yes, thank you," Luis replied shortly, paying for the supplies. He carried the packages out to the wagon, helping Abby up before climbing in himself. As they left town, the road wound past the creek that fed their ranch. Abby noticed a group of men in neat suits standing along the bank, driving wooden stakes into the ground. Their brass surveying equipment gleamed in the sun. Luis's hands tightened on the reins. "Railroad men," he muttered darkly, marking their territory like wolves. He clicked to the horses, urging them to move faster past the surveyors, who barely glanced up from their work. The sight cast a shadow over their ride home. Abby could feel the tension in Luis's silence, knowing he was thinking about the neighbor's warning from the night before. The railroad's presence so close to their water source was an undeniable threat. When they reached the ranch, the afternoon heat had become oppressive. Abby went straight to the kitchen to prepare supper, while Luis unloaded the supplies and saw to the horses. She could hear him moving around the barn, his boots striking the ground harder than usual, a sign of his worry. She put extra care into the evening meal, making dumplings to go with the stew. When Luis came in, the kitchen was warm with good smells and the table was neatly set. He washed up at the pump outside, then took his seat with a weary sigh. "Thank you," he said quietly as she served him. "For everything today. Can't have been easy, facing all those gossips." "Their words cannot harm us," Abby replied, though her heart warmed at his concern. "God knows our purpose here." After supper, Luis settled at his desk with the ranch ledger, his face grave as he studied the columns of numbers. Abby cleared the table and washed the dishes, then took up her mending in the chair by the window. The scratch of Luis's pen and the whisper of her needle filled the comfortable silence. Outside, heat lightning began to flicker on the horizon, illuminating towering thunderheads. The air felt heavy with coming rain, matching the weight of uncertainty that hung over them. Yet, despite the growing storm and the challenges they faced, the house felt different now, more settled, as if their official union had strengthened its foundations. Abby's needle moved steadily through the fabric as she watched Luis work. His broad shoulders were tense with worry about the railroad's threats, but he had stood beside her proudly today, defending their unusual marriage against the town's judgment. Whatever storms approached, they would face them together. The lightning flashed again, closer now, and thunder rumbled in the distance. Luis looked up from his ledger, meeting Abby's eyes across the lamplit room. For a moment, they sat in silent understanding. Two people brought together by circumstance, now bound by choice and necessity, finding unexpected comfort in each other's presence as the storm gathered around them. Thunder crashed overhead, shaking the farmhouse windows in their frames. Abby lay in her bed, listening to the storm's fury. The rain drummed against the roof like 1,000 galloping hooves, while lightning transformed the darkness into brief moments of harsh daylight. She pulled the quilt tighter around her shoulders, whispering prayers into the tumultuous night. "Lord, grant me strength in this new life. Guide my steps as I build a home here." The words brought comfort, as they always had, even during her darkest days in Pennsylvania. The wind howled through gaps in the walls, making the lamp on her bedside table flicker. Abby watched the shadows dance across the ceiling, remembering how different everything had been just days ago. The courthouse, the cruel laughter, Luis stepping forward. It felt like another lifetime. Sleep proved elusive as the storm raged on. Abby used the quiet hours to pray for wisdom, for Luis, for their unusual marriage, and for the strength to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Sometime near dawn, the storm's fury finally began to fade, replaced by a gentle patter of rain. When morning light finally crept through her window, Abby rose and dressed quickly in her plain dress and apron. The floorboards were cool beneath her feet as she made her way to the kitchen. Through the window, she could see puddles reflecting the gray sky, and mud stretched as far as the eye could see. She had just gotten the coffee brewing when she heard Luis's boots on the porch. He came in, shaking water from his hat. "Fences need checking," he said, accepting the cup she offered. "Storm might have done some damage." "I'll have breakfast ready when you return," Abby promised, already reaching for the flour bin. Luis nodded gratefully and headed back out into the wet morning. Abby watched through the window as he saddled his horse and rode out, his figure growing smaller against the stormy horizon. She busied herself with breakfast preparations, mixing biscuit dough with practiced hands while the stove warmed the kitchen. The familiar tasks brought comfort. This, at least, she knew how to do well. Soon, the smell of coffee and fresh-baked biscuits filled the house. Luis returned as she was setting the table, his clothes splattered with mud but his expression relieved. "Fences held," he reported, washing up at the pump outside before coming to the table. "Lost one section near the creek, but nothing we can't fix." They ate in companionable silence, broken only by the occasional drip of water from the roof and the clink of spoons against plates. Abby had just begun clearing the dishes when the sound of hoofbeats approached the house. A lone rider appeared through the misty rain, a boy on a rangy pinto pony. He couldn't have been more than 15, with dark hair and features that spoke of mixed heritage. His clothes were worn but clean, and he carried only a small bundle tied to his saddle. Luis went to the door, his expression softening slightly. "Henry," he said by way of greeting. The boy dismounted, leading his pony under the shelter of the porch. His movements were careful, almost wary, like a wild creature unsure of its welcome. "Uncle Luis," he replied quietly. Abby stood in the doorway, noting how the boy's eyes darted between them, assessing. His face bore the same quiet dignity as his uncle's, though shadow of hurt lingered in his expression. "They won't have me at the school anymore," Henry said finally, his voice steady despite the pain evident in his words. "Said I don't belong there. Got nowhere else to go." Luis's jaw tightened, but before he could speak, Abby stepped forward. "You must be cold and hungry," she said warmly. "Come in where it's dry. I'll fix you something to eat." Henry glanced at his uncle, who gave a slight nod. The boy followed Abby into the kitchen, his movements still cautious. She pulled out a chair at the table and began warming leftover biscuits and coffee. "I'm Abby," she said as she worked. "Your uncle and I were married yesterday." Henry's dark eyes widened slightly at this news, but he said nothing. Luis leaned against the doorframe, watching the interaction with an unreadable expression. "You can stay a while," he said finally. "Could use the help with fence mending after the storm." Relief flickered across Henry's face, though he tried to hide it. "Much obliged," he murmured. Abby set a plate of food before him, and the boy ate carefully, his manners impeccable despite his obvious hunger. When he finished, he immediately offered to help with the dishes. "First, let's find you a dry shirt," Abby said. "And there's a small room off the back porch that would make a fine bedroom once we clean it up a bit." Throughout the day, Henry proved himself useful, working alongside Luis to repair the damaged fence section. Though he spoke little, his actions showed both skill and dedication. Abby watched from the kitchen window as uncle and nephew worked together, noting how their movements mirrored each other. By evening, the sky had cleared enough to paint the western horizon in shades of purple and gold. Abby called them in to supper, a hearty stew with dumplings that filled the kitchen with savory warmth. Before they ate, Abby bowed her head as she always did. "Henry," she said gently, "would you like to join us in prayer?" The boy hesitated, then slowly nodded. Luis looked surprised but followed suit as Abby gave thanks for their food, their safety through the storm, and the blessing of family. When she finished, Henry was watching her with an expression of cautious wonder. The faintest smile touched his lips, the first they'd seen all day. It transformed his serious face, revealing the boy beneath the careful exterior. They ate together, the silence more comfortable now. Outside, the last light faded from the sky, and stars began to peek through breaks in the clouds. The lamp on the table cast a warm glow over their small group. Luis with his quiet strength, Henry gradually relaxing into his place, and Abby feeling the first real stirrings of home since leaving Pennsylvania. Later, as she washed the supper dishes, Abby heard Henry's soft footsteps behind her. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for the food, and for—" He trailed off, unable to put into words what her simple kindness had meant. "You're family now," Abby replied simply. "That's what matters." Henry nodded and slipped away to his room, but Abby caught sight of that small smile again. She looked out the window into the gathering darkness, where the lights of the railroad camp glowed in the distance like watchful eyes. The sight sent a shiver down her spine, reminding her of the challenges still ahead. But here in the warm kitchen, with the sounds of Luis banking the fire and Henry's quiet movements in his new room, Abby felt something she hadn't dared hope for. The beginning of a real family, woven together from broken pieces into something new and precious. She finished the dishes and began preparing for the next day, her heart full of gratitude. Whatever threats loomed on the horizon, they would face them together, strengthened by the bonds forming between them. Bonds forged not by blood or circumstance, but by choice and acceptance and love. The days settled into a gentle rhythm at the Boone Ranch. Each morning, Abby rose before dawn, the floorboards creaking softly under her feet as she made her way to the kitchen. The familiar routines of her Amish upbringing guided her hands, stoking the stove, brewing coffee, mixing dough for fresh bread. Luis and Henry would come in from early chores to find breakfast waiting: hot biscuits, eggs from the henhouse, and strong coffee. They ate in comfortable silence, the morning light growing stronger through the Ninda. After the men headed out to work, Abby turned her attention to the house. She tackled each room methodically, sweeping away months of dust and neglect. Curtains were washed and mended, floors scrubbed until they gleamed, and shelves organized with careful precision. Her capable hands brought order from chaos, one task at a time. The kitchen became her sanctuary. She lined up preserving jars, checked supplies, and planned ahead for winter. The pantry slowly filled with her handiwork, rows of pickled vegetables, dried herbs hanging from the rafters, and fresh-baked bread cooling on the counter. The house began to smell of yeast and soap instead of dust and emptiness. Luis noticed the changes, though he spoke little of them. His eyes would linger on new touches, a patched quilt draped over a chair, wildflowers in a tin can on the table, the gleam of polished window panes. The stiffness in his shoulder seemed to ease a bit when he came in from long days of work to find the house warm and welcoming. Henry, too, responded to the gentle transformation. He began lingering after meals instead of rushing away, offering to help with dishes or chores. Under Abby's patient guidance, his defensive shell slowly softened. She taught him to knead bread dough, praising his strong hands, and he showed her how to identify healing plants his mother had taught him about. One morning, Luis announced he needed to ride into town for supplies. The summer sun was already hot as he saddled his horse, promising to return by afternoon. Abby watched him ride away, then turned to the quiet house. Henry was out checking fence lines, leaving her alone with her thoughts. She retrieved her journal from its hiding place between her dresses, a simple leather-bound book, its pages filled with neat script. Settling at the kitchen table, she opened to a fresh page and began to write, her pen scratching softly against the paper. The words flowed freely as she recorded the story she had kept locked inside, how the bishop in her Pennsylvania community had commanded her to marry Elder Stoltzfus, a cruel man 3 times her age. She wrote of the elder's cold eyes and harder heart, how he had mocked her size and belittled her spirit. Her hand trembled as she described her refusal to bow to their demands, choosing exile over a lifetime of submission to cruelty. The morning passed as she wrote, sunlight shifting across the wooden table. She was so absorbed in her task that she didn't hear Luis's return until his boots sounded on the porch. Hastily, she closed the journal, wiping away tears she hadn't realized were falling. Luis entered, arms full of supplies. He paused when he saw her face, setting down his packages with careful movements. "You all right?" he asked quietly. Abby smoothed her apron, considering her words. Finally, she spoke softly. "I was writing about why I left my community in Pennsylvania." Luis pulled out a chair and sat, his manner gentle. "Would you tell me?" Slowly, haltingly, Abby shared pieces of her story. She spoke of the bishop's decree, the elder's cruelty, and her choice to leave rather than submit. Her voice grew stronger as she described finding courage in prayer and scripture, knowing God would not want her bound to a loveless marriage built on fear. Luis listened without interruption, his weathered hands folded on the table. When she finished, silence filled the kitchen. Finally, he spoke, his voice rough with emotion. "Takes courage to stand up against wrong even when it costs you everything. I respect that." Abby met his eyes, seeing understanding there instead of judgment. Something tight in her chest began to ease. "Thank you," she whispered. They worked together to put away the supplies, moving around each other with growing comfort. When Henry returned from his fence mending, he found them preparing supper, the kitchen warm with the smell of beef stew and fresh bread. The boy watched them as they ate, noting how Luis passed Abby the salt before she asked, how she filled his coffee cup without being told it was empty. Small gestures, but they spoke volumes about the quiet bond forming between them. After supper, they gathered near the fireplace. The summer evening was cool enough to warrant a small blaze, its light dancing on the walls. Henry settled in a corner with a piece of wood and his carving knife, his skilled hands shaping something from the pale pine. Abby took up her mending, humming softly as she worked. The tune was an old hymn from her childhood, its familiar melody rising and falling in the peaceful quiet. Luis sat in his chair, ostensibly reading a newspaper from town, but his eyes kept straying to Abby's serene face in the firelight. The music touched something in him he'd thought long buried, a warmth, a spark of joy he hadn't felt since losing his wife. He found himself listening intently, letting the gentle notes wash over him like a healing balm. Time slipped by in comfortable silence, broken only by the crackle of the fire. the soft scrape of Henry's knife against wood, and Abby's sweet humming. When the boy's eyes began to droop, she quietly suggested it was time for bed. Henry nodded, carefully wrapping his half-finished carving in a cloth. "Good night," he murmured, receiving warm responses from both adults. Abby gathered her mending and rose to bank the fire. Louise watched as she moved around the room, straightening cushions and gathering stray items with practiced efficiency. When she reached for the lamp, she paused, looking back at him with a small smile. "Good night, Louise," she said softly before blowing out the flame. In the darkness, Louise sat for a long moment, listening to her footsteps retreat to her room. The house settled around him with familiar creaks and sighs, but it felt different now, warmer, more alive. Like a home again, he realized, rather than just a place to sleep. In her room, Abby prepared for bed by moonlight, her heart lighter than it had been in months. She knelt for her evening prayers, giving thanks for this new life that was slowly, steadily becoming her own. The ranch was changing her as much as she was changing it, healing old wounds and offering fresh hope. As she drifted toward sleep, the coyotes' distant songs echoed across the valley, but their howls no longer seemed lonely. Instead, they were a reminder that even in the wild places, families found ways to stay together to sing their songs of belonging beneath the vast Colorado sky. Dawn had barely touched the horizon when hoofbeats thundered up to the ranch house. Luis was already outside, checking the morning feed, when Tom Henderson, his closest neighbor, rode up hard on a lathered horse. The man's face was ashen, his hands trembling as he thrust a crumpled paper toward Luis. "They've done it," Tom choked out, his voice rough with emotion. "Railroad's taken everything. Water rights, grazing land, all of it. They drove my cattle off yesterday. Said the land ain't mine no more." Luis took the document, his own hands growing cold as he read. Legal terms jumped out at him. Cessation of rights, eminent domain, immediate evacuation. The paper bore an official seal and signature. The screen door creaked as Abby stepped onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. She'd been starting breakfast, but the urgency in Tom's voice had drawn her out. Henry appeared from the barn, moving closer to hear. "How can they do this?" Luis demanded, his voice tight with anger. "Your family's worked that land for 20 years. Tom shook his head, shoulders slumping. "They got papers I never seen before, claiming rights from way back. Said my deed ain't worth the paper it's printed on." He looked at Luis with haunted eyes. "You're next, friend. They're working their way up the valley." Luis's jaw clenched. Without a word, he strode to the barn, his spurs ringing against the packed earth. "Henry," he called. "Saddle 3 horses. We're riding to town." Abby hurried inside, changing quickly into her riding skirt. She knew every moment counted now. When she emerged, Luis had already saddled his big bay stallion. Henry led out 2 more horses, including the gentle mare Luis had bought for them Abby last month. They set out as the sun cleared the mountains, dust rising behind their horses' hooves. The road to town stretched long before them, weaving through sun-baked hills and across shallow creek beds. Heat shimmered off the rocky ground, making the air thick and heavy. Abby's mare plodded steadily beside Luis's stallion. She studied his profile, noting the tight lines around his mouth, the way his hands gripped the reins too hard. Henry rode slightly behind them, his young face serious beyond his years. The journey took nearly 3 hours. By the time they reached town, their clothes were coated in dust, and sweat had darkened the horses' flanks. Luis led them straight to the law office, a narrow building wedged between the general store and the barber shop. Inside, the air was stuffy despite the open windows. A clerk directed them to wait, his eyes sliding past them dismissively. They sat on hard wooden chairs, listening to the tick of a wall clock and the scratch of pens from inner offices. Finally, the railroad's representative emerged. Clayton Reeves, a sharp-dressed man with cold eyes and manicured hands. His smile didn't reach his eyes as he invited them into his office. "Ah, Mr. Boone," he said, settling behind his desk. "I expected we'd be seeing you soon." His gaze flickered briefly over Abby and Henry before dismissing them entirely. Luis remained standing, his hat crushed in his hands. "What's this about taking Tom Henderson's water rights?" Reeves's smile widened as he withdrew several documents from his desk. "Simply a matter of proper documentation, my friend. The railroad's claim to these water resources predates any local arrangements." He emphasized the word with a subtle contempt. "Those creeks have watered our cattle since before the railroad even existed," Luis argued, his voice growing heated. But that's where you're wrong." Reeves spread out several yellowed papers. "These grants you see establish the railroad's right to all water resources in this valley, signed and sealed by territorial authorities in 1862. Abby, who had been listening intently, leaned forward slightly. Something in the man's tone, in the way he handled those papers, raised a warning flag in her mind. She'd spent years helping her father with business correspondence back in Pennsylvania, learning to spot inconsistencies in contracts and agreements. "May I?" she asked quietly, reaching for one of the documents. Reeves hesitated, then shrugged, clearly considering her harmless. Abby studied the paper carefully, noting the letterhead, the pattern of the official seal, the formatting of the text. Small details caught her attention, things that didn't quite match what she remembered from similar documents she'd seen before. "Luis," she said softly, "these papers deserve closer examination. The dating seems irregular." Reeves snatched the document back, his composure slipping slightly. "The legal standing is quite clear, madam. This isn't a matter for domestic consultation." But Luis had caught the note in Abby's voice. He straightened, some of the despair leaving his face. "We'll need time to review our options," he said firmly. "Time is a luxury you don't have," Reeves snapped. "The railroad's claims will be enforced immediately. I suggest you prepare accordingly." They left the office with copies of the notices, the afternoon sun still beating down mercilessly. Luis led them directly to the church, a small white building at the edge of town. Inside, the air was cooler, scented with pine wood and beeswax. Pastor Matthews listened gravely to their story, his weathered face growing more troubled with each detail. When Luis finished, the pastor shook his head slowly. "The railroad's influence reaches far beyond this valley," he warned. "They've broken stronger men than us, Luis. Even the territorial governor won't stand against them." "So we should just give up?" Henry burst out, his young voice cracking with emotion. "Let them take everything?" The pastor spread his hands helplessly. "I'll pray for you all, but..." He glanced at the church windows, where the setting sun painted the glass blood red. "Sometimes we must accept what we cannot change." They rode home in heavy silence, the sunset casting long shadows across the valley. Dust coated their clothes, and weariness dragged at their shoulders. The ranch house emerged from the gathering dusk, its windows dark and unwelcoming. Abby moved quietly through the kitchen, preparing a simple supper of bread and stew. They ate without speaking, each lost in their own thoughts. Luis barely touched his food, staring instead at his calloused hands resting on the table. She watched him from the corner of her eye, seeing the doubt and defeat creeping into his expression. This proud, decent man who had saved her from humiliation was now facing the loss of everything he'd worked for. The thought made something fierce and protective stir in her heart. Henry pushed his plate away, unable to eat more. "What are we going to do?" he asked, his voice small in the lamplight. Luis didn't answer, but Abby saw his shoulders slump further. The sight strengthened her resolve. She might have left her old life behind, but she hadn't left behind her father's teachings about justice or her mother's lessons about standing firm in faith. As she gathered the dishes, Abby's mind was already working, examining angles, considering possibilities. She remembered inconsistencies in those railroad documents, the spacing of the text, the weight of the paper, tiny details that nagged at her trained eye. There might be hope there, if they knew where to look. She watched Luis walk out onto the porch, his figure dark against the starlit sky. Despair would not have the final word, she promised herself. Not while she had breath to fight and pray. This home, this family they were building, it was worth defending with every ounce of strength she possessed. Later, as she prepared for bed, Abby knelt longer than usual in prayer. She asked not just for guidance and protection, but for wisdom to see the path forward and courage to walk it. The ranch had become more than just a refuge to her now. It was where she had found respect, purpose, and the beginnings of love. Rising from her prayers, she heard Luis still moving restlessly through the house, unable to find peace. Tomorrow would bring its own battles, but tonight, she held fast to her conviction. God had not led her here only to see this family broken by greed and corruption. There would be a way forward. They just had to be strong enough to find it. Dawn brought no comfort to the Boone Ranch. The morning air hung heavy with unspoken worries as Luis moved through his chores like a man walking through deep water. His movements were mechanical, his jaw tight with anger that had no outlet. In the barn, he pitched hay with unnecessary force, each thrust of the fork betraying his inner turmoil. The horses shifted uneasily, sensing his mood. Sweat darkened his shirt despite the early hour, evidence of emotion as much as exertion. Abby watched from the barn door, her heart aching at his obvious distress. She had risen early to prepare breakfast, hoping good food might ease their troubles, but Luis had barely touched the eggs and biscuits. Now, seeing him wrestle with his inner demons, she knew she could not remain silent. "The good book says trials refine the soul like fire refines silver," she said softly, stepping into the barn. Her skirts rustled against the straw as she approached him. Luis's fork stopped mid-motion. For a moment, he stood frozen, then he threw the tool down with such force that it clattered against the wooden floor. The horses startled, stamping their hooves. "What good is refinement if I lose everything?" His voice cracked with emotion. "The land, the cattle, the creek, it's all slipping away. I promised to protect this place, to give Henry a home, to..." He turned to her, his face naked with anguish. "I've failed everyone. Failed you." Abby stepped closer, her movements careful and deliberate. "God has not abandoned us," she said firmly. "He led me here, to this place, to this family. That was no accident." Luis's laugh was bitter. "God? Where was he when my wife died, when the winter nearly broke us? When the railroad started stealing water rights?" "Right here," Abby answered, touching his arm gently. "Working through people who choose to stand together, to fight with truth instead of despair." Before Luis could respond, they heard hoofbeats approaching at a gallop. Henry burst into the yard, his horse lathered and his young face tight with distress. Luis and Abby hurried out to meet him. "Railroad men," Henry gasped, sliding from his saddle. "Down by the lower creek. They're driving cattle away from the water, saying we have no right to it anymore." His hands trembled as he gripped the reins. "They've got guns! Uncle Luis!" Luis's face darkened like a thundercloud. He strode toward the house, his purpose clear in every step. "I'll show them who has rights to that water," he growled, reaching for his rifle above the door. "No!" Abby moved quickly to block his path. "Violence will only give them what they want, an excuse to take everything immediately." "So we just let them steal our water?" Luis demanded, his voice rising. "Watch our cattle die of thirst while they laugh?" "We fight with wisdom, not weapons," Abby insisted, standing her ground. "Those papers weren't right. I saw it in the lawyer's office. We need proof, not powder burns." Luis's hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. The rifle waited above the door, promising quick action, simple solutions. But Abby's steady gaze held him, offering a different kind of strength. The tension stretched between them until Henry spoke up, his voice small but clear. "I don't want to lose another home." He swallowed hard, looking down at his boots. "The school, the town, nowhere else ever wanted me. But here." He gestured vaguely at the ranch, encompassing more than just the buildings and land. Abby's heart melted at the boy's words. She went to him, putting an arm around his shoulders. "Listen to me, Henry Boone," she said firmly. "We will fight for this place, not with guns and anger, but with truth and faith. God didn't bring us together to see us scattered." Luis watched them, his anger warring with something deeper. Slowly, his shoulders dropped, the violent energy draining away. He stepped back from the door, leaving the rifle untouched. The day crawled by in tense silence. They all worked harder than usual, as if physical labor could drive away their fears. Abby baked bread and cleaned with fierce determination. Luis repaired fences with grim focus. Henry moved between them like a shadow, helping where needed but saying little. When evening came, they gathered around the supper table. The food was good, Abby had made sure of that, but they ate without tasting it. The silence felt heavy, weighted with unspoken fears and half-formed plans. Finally, Henry pushed his plate away, unable to pretend anymore. "What if they come tomorrow?" he asked, his voice cracking. "What if they take everything?" Abby reached across the table and took his hand. "Then we face it together," she said firmly. "This is your home, Henry. We won't give up without a fight, the right kind of fight." Luis watched them from his end of the table. The lamplight caught the silver threading through his dark hair, the lines worry had carved around his eyes. His anger still simmered, but it was tempered now by something else. Perhaps hope, perhaps faith. When the meal ended, Abby bowed her head in prayer as she always did. Her voice was quiet but steady as she thanked God for their food, their family, and asked for guidance in their struggles. Luis and Henry remained silent, but they kept their heads bowed until she finished. Later, as the fire burned low in the hearth, Luis sat alone, watching the flames dance and die. The house creaked around him. Familiar sounds that had once meant comfort, but now seemed to echo with uncertainty. From the kitchen came the soft sounds of Abby cleaning up, humming a hymn under her breath. His anger still burned, but it was different now. Less consuming, more focused. Abby's presence was like a cool hand on a fever, not removing the heat, but making it bearable. Her quiet strength challenged him, offering a different path than the one his rage would choose. He thought of Henry's words about home, of Abby's unwavering faith, of his own promise to protect them both. The railroad might have money and power, but they had something else, something that couldn't be measured in dollars or water rights. The flames flickered lower, casting shadows on the walls. Outside, a coyote called, lonely and wild. Luis felt the pull of two futures, one born of anger and violence, the other requiring a kind of courage he wasn't sure he possessed. But when Abby's hymn drifted to him again, soft and sure in the darkness, he felt his heart lean toward hope. 3 days after the confrontation at the creek, Luis rode into town alone, hoping the lawyer might have found something to help their case. The August sun beat down mercilessly as he tied his horse outside the law office, his boots stirring dust on the wooden sidewalk. Inside, the news crushed what little hope remained. The lawyer, mopping his brow with a handkerchief, spread several documents across his desk. One bore Maria's signature. Luis recognized the shaky hand of his late wife's final days. "I'm sorry, Mr. Boone," the lawyer said, pointing to the critical lines. "During her illness last winter, your wife signed this paper. It appears to grant certain grazing rights to the railroad's holding company." Luis stared at the signature, remembering how the fever had clouded Maria's mind near the end. His throat tightened. She wouldn't have understood what she was signing. "I believe you," the lawyer admitted, "but legally it complicates things. The railroad will use this to strengthen their claim." The ride home felt endless. Each hoofbeat echoed Luis's darkening thoughts. The ranch had been his life's work, his legacy for Henry, his chance to give Abby a real home. Now it seemed to be slipping through his fingers like water. He found Abby in the kitchen, kneading bread dough with strong, steady movements. She looked up as he entered, flour dusting her arms, and read the defeat in his face. "They found a paper," he said heavily, dropping into a chair. "Maria signed something during her fever. The lawyer says—" "Show me," Abby interrupted, wiping her hands on her apron. Her voice held none of the despair he felt, only determination. Luis pulled the lawyer's copy from his shirt pocket, smoothing it on the table. Abby studied it intently, her brow furrowed. "We need to check everything," she declared. "Every deed, every record. The truth leaves tracks, Luis. We just have to find them." "What's the use?" Luis asked bitterly. "The railroad has money, lawyers, power, and we have God's guidance and clear eyes," Abby cut in firmly. "The barn loft. You said there were old ledgers stored up there?" Luis nodded slowly. "Years of records. Maria kept everything." "Henry!" Abby called through the open door. The boy appeared from the corral where he'd been mending tack. "We need your help in the loft." The afternoon sun slanted through gaps in the barn boards as they climbed to the loft. Dust motes danced in the golden beams. Luis watched as Abby and Henry began sorting through boxes and trunks, their determination kindling a tiny spark of hope he dared not trust. Hours passed. They worked methodically through yellowed papers, faded letters, and leather-bound ledgers. Henry proved to have a sharp eye for dates and details, while Abby's practical mind kept their search organized. "Look at this," Abby said suddenly, her voice tight with excitement. She held up a packet of papers, their edges crumbling with age. Land grants from 1853, and here, she pulled out another document. Treaty boundaries, marked with the Apache Nation, dated 1848. Luis leaned closer, squinting at the faded ink. What does it mean? It means the railroad's claim might be built on sand, Abby explained, her eyes bright. These boundaries and water rights were established long before they laid their first rail. If the treaties are still valid. They are. Henry spoke up, his voice stronger than usual. Elder Chano talks about them. He keeps the old stories, knows all the boundaries. He hesitated, then added, I could ride out to speak with him. He's my mother's kinsman. He would tell me the truth. Luis frowned, uncomfortable with the idea of involving the Apache elder, but Abby was nodding enthusiastically. The elder's knowledge could be crucial, she said. These papers show one side of the story. His wisdom might show us the other. Luis looked between them, his nephew's earnest face, his wife's steady gaze. Something shifted in his chest, a realignment of trust and possibility. How long to ride there and back, he asked Henry. If I leave at first light, I can return by sunset tomorrow. Henry answered quickly, as if afraid Luis might change his mind. Luis nodded slowly. Take the bay mare. She's sure-footed on the mountain trails. They worked until the light failed, carefully organizing the documents they'd found. Abby insisted on moving them to the house where they would be safer, laying them out on the kitchen table like pieces of a puzzle. As the lamp burned low that evening, they gathered for a late supper. The kitchen felt different somehow, charged with purpose rather than heavy with defeat. Henry ate quickly, eager to prepare for his morning ride. Abby served seconds of stew, knowing the boy would need strength for his journey. Outside, wolves began their nightly chorus, their howls echoing off the distant cliffs. But inside, the lamp cast a warm circle of light over the table, where maps and documents lay alongside their plates. Luis found himself studying Abby's face as she bent over the papers, making notes in her clear hand. He saw her differently now, not as the woman he'd rescued from humiliation, but as someone whose strength might help save them all. Her quiet faith had become a foundation he hadn't known he needed. Her practical wisdom saw paths he had missed in his anger and despair. We'll need to present this carefully, Abby was saying, tapping the documents. The treaties first, then the original land grants. If Elder Chano can confirm the boundaries, the railroad won't just give up, Luis warned. No, Abby agreed, meeting his eyes. But neither will we. Henry looked between them, hope brightening his young face. We're really going to fight them. With truth instead of guns, Abby said firmly. With laws instead of threats. She reached across the table and squeezed Luis's hand. Together. Luis turned his palm up, curling his fingers around hers. The touch anchored him, as solid as the land itself. He remembered the day in the courthouse, how he'd stepped forward to claim this woman everyone else mocked or ignored. God's hand in that moment had been clearer than he'd known. Later, after Henry had gone to bed and the kitchen was set to rights, Luis and Abby stood together at the door. The night air carried the scent of sage and distant rain. Wolves called again, their voices wild and free. Thank you, Luis said quietly. Abby turned to him, her face questioning in the lamplight. For not giving up, he explained. For seeing hope where I saw only loss. The Lord guides our steps, she replied simply. Even when the path seems dark. Luis nodded, understanding now that she had been an answer to prayers he hadn't even known to pray. Not just a wife, but a partner. Not just a housekeeper, but a source of strength. Tomorrow would bring its own battles, but tonight, watching Abby's sure movements as she banked the fire and set out Henry's traveling food for morning, Luis felt something he had thought lost forever. Peace. The lamp flickered low, casting gentle shadows on the walls of the home they were fighting to save. Outside, the wolves sang their ancient songs to the stars, but inside, hope had taken root and begun to grow. The first pale light of dawn painted the eastern sky when Henry led the bay mare from the barn. His breath made small clouds in the cool morning air as he tightened the cinch and checked his saddlebags one final time. Abby stood in the doorway, a cloth-wrapped package in her hands. "Bread and dried beef for your journey," she said, tucking the food into his saddlebag. "And a jar of water." Luis emerged from the barn, his face etched with worry. "Stay on the main trails," he instructed, adjusting Henry's stirrup length. "And if anything feels wrong—" "I'll be careful, Uncle Luis," Henry promised, swinging into the saddle with easy grace. The mare shifted beneath him, eager to move. Abby touched Luis's arm gently. "He knows the way. The Lord will watch over him." They stood together, watching until Henry's figure disappeared over the ridge. The sun climbed higher, burning off the morning mist as they turned to the day's work. There were fences to mend and cattle to move to fresh grazing. Working side by side under the hot sun, Luis and Abby fell into a steady rhythm. She handed him fence wire and tools while he wrestled with broken posts. The physical labor helped mask their anxiety, but couldn't entirely hide it. "What if they turn him away?" Luis finally voiced his fear, driving a post into the rocky soil with more force than necessary. "The reservation. They have reason to distrust us white folks." Abby wiped sweat from her brow, considering her words carefully. "Henry carries both worlds in his heart," she said. "That's not weakness. It's strength. He understands both sides in a way few can." Luis paused, leaning on his post-hole digger. "Like you do," he said quietly, "understanding different ways." She smiled slightly, remembering her own journey from Pennsylvania to this wild country. "God's truth speaks in many voices," she replied. "We just have to listen carefully." They worked through the heat of the day, moving the herd to fresh grass near the creek. The cattle were thin but growing stronger under their care. Abby saw how Luis touched each animal gently as they passed, checking for signs of illness or injury. His tenderness with the creatures revealed the heart he tried to hide. As the sun began its westward slide, they returned to the house. Abby busied herself preparing supper, while Luis paced between the porch and the barn, watching the ridge where Henry had disappeared that morning. The sky had turned gold and purple when hoofbeats finally sounded in the yard. Luis strode out, Abby close behind. Henry rode in first, followed by a second rider, a tall man with silver-streaked hair and dignified bearing. "Elder Chano," Henry announced proudly, dismounting to help the older man from his horse. The Apache elder's dark eyes were sharp and knowing as he greeted them. "Henry speaks of papers and treaties," he said, his voice deep and measured, "of water rights and railroad men who forget their promises." Luis stepped forward, uncertainty warring with hope on his face. "We would be honored if you would share our meal and look at what we've found." Inside, Abby quickly set another place at the table while Luis brought the lamp closer. The documents lay spread out, edges curling in the evening air. Elder Chano studied them carefully, his weathered fingers tracing the faded ink. "Yes," he said finally, tapping one of the oldest papers. "These boundaries were set when my father was young. The stream you call Crystal Creek, we named it Singing Waters, was given to the mixed blood families who chose to live as ranchers. Your wife's people." Luis leaned forward intently. "Then the railroad's claim cannot stand without federal approval," Chano confirmed. "The treaties protected these lands. Even Washington's lawmakers must honor them, though they often try to forget." Joy bloomed in Abby's chest. She reached for Luis's hand, feeling it tremble slightly as their fingers intertwined. Henry beamed from his place beside the elder, pride shining in his young face. They shared the meal Abby had prepared: beef stew, fresh bread, and preserved peaches. Elder Chano ate slowly, speaking between bites of wisdom passed down through generations. "Justice moves like water," he said, breaking off a piece of bread. "Sometimes fast, sometimes slow, but always finding its way. The railroad men think power comes from paper and money. They forget that true strength flows from the land itself and from the people who honor it." The lamp cast warm shadows on the walls as they talked, mapping out their strategy. Chano would speak with other elders who remembered the treaties. Henry would serve as a bridge between the communities. The railroad's greed had finally met a force it couldn't simply push aside. Truth, preserved in both written records, and living memory. After the meal, Luis walked Elder Chano to his horse. They spoke quietly in the yard while Abby and Henry cleared the table. Through the window, she watched the two men clasp hands before the elder mounted and rode into the gathering darkness. Luis returned to find Henry building up the fire, while Abby set water to heat for washing dishes. The three of them moved around the kitchen in comfortable silence, each absorbed in their own thoughts. Finally, Henry yawned and bid them goodnight, pausing to touch the documents on the table reverently before climbing the stairs to his room. His footsteps creaked overhead as he settled in. Luis stood before the fire, its light playing across his features. Abby was about to turn to the dishes when his voice stopped her. "You did this," he said softly, turning to face her. "Your faith, your persistence, when I was ready to give up, you found a way forward." Abby felt heat rise in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the fire. "The Lord guided us," she demurred. "I just remembered that truth leaves tracks like you taught me about tracking cattle." Luis crossed to her, taking her work-roughened hands in his. "You've brought life back to this place," he said. "Not just order and good meals, but hope. Light." He swallowed hard. "I didn't know how dark it had grown until you came." Abby's heart thundered in her chest. She looked down at their joined hands, his sun-browned and calloused, hers pale and strong from years of bread-making and quilting. Different paths that had somehow led them here, to this moment. From his perch on the stairs, hidden in shadow, Henry watched his uncle and Abby standing together in the firelight. His young heart swelled with a feeling he had almost forgotten: belonging. This was what family looked like, he realized. Not perfect, not all the same, but bound together by something stronger than blood. The fire crackled softly, sending sparks up the chimney to join the stars. Outside, a lone coyote called, but its wild voice couldn't touch the warmth within. Hope glowed in the little house like a banked flame, ready to burst into full brightness with the coming dawn. Luis released Abby's hands gently, moving to bank the fire for the night. She returned to her dishes, but the air between them had changed, grown warmer, more certain. They had found solid ground to stand on, and neither the railroad's threats nor the uncertain future ahead could shake their newfound strength. The lamp burned low as they finished their evening tasks, each movement now carrying the weight of promise rather than despair. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but tonight, they could rest in the knowledge that truth and justice stood on their side. God's hand had led them this far. His guidance would see them through whatever battles lay ahead. Morning sunlight streamed through the kitchen window as Abby cleared away breakfast dishes. Her hands moved steadily, but her mind raced ahead to the task before them. Luis sat at the worn table, spreading out papers and ledgers like a general planning a campaign. "We must be thorough," Abby said, drying her hands on her apron. "Every document tells part of the story." Luis nodded, his face etched with concentration. "The judge won't make this easy. He's still sore about—" He trailed off, glancing at Abby. "About the day you claimed me," she finished softly. "But truth speaks louder than pride, Luis." Henry appeared in the doorway, arms full of dusty record books from the barn loft. His young face was serious as he set them carefully on the table. "I found more of Aunt Sarah's papers," he said. "She kept everything neat like you do, Abby." Abby smiled at the boy, touched by the comparison to Luis's late wife. She pulled her writing box close, taking out fresh paper and a sharpened pencil. Her Pennsylvania schooling had taught her the importance of clear records, and now those skills would serve them well. "We'll start with the oldest treaties," she said, beginning to write in her precise hand, "then show how each later document builds on those rights." Luis watched her work, amazed at how her quiet strength seemed to grow with each challenge. She had transformed from the trembling woman at the courthouse into someone who could face down railroad lawyers without flinching. The morning passed in steady work. Abby's notes grew into organized stacks while Luis practiced speaking their case aloud, his words becoming sharper and more confident with each attempt. Henry moved between them, fetching supplies and offering his own insights about the land's history. Just as they broke for the midday meal, hoofbeats sounded in the yard. Henry went to the door, returning with a telegram that made his dark eyes widen. 3 days, he said, handing the paper to Luis. "The hearing's set for 3 days from now." Luis's face tightened as he read the message. The paper crinkled in his grip, and Abby saw fear flash across his features. She knew what troubled him, the thought of standing before the townspeople who had witnessed their unusual beginning. "Luis," she said gently, laying her hand on his arm, "remember how you stood that day? With dignity and kindness, when others chose cruelty?" He met her eyes, something softening in his expression. "You gave me courage then," he admitted quietly, "though you didn't know it." Henry watched them, a small smile playing at his lips. "We'll show them," he said firmly. "All of us together." They worked through the afternoon and into the evening, the lamp burning bright as darkness gathered outside. Abby's fingers grew stained with ink as she copied important passages. Luis rehearsed his testimony, his voice growing stronger with each telling. Henry organized the documents into clear order, marking important pages with strips of cloth. The night deepened, bringing the yipping of coyotes across the prairie. But inside the warm circle of lamplight, determination held firm. When Abby's eyes grew tired, Luis insisted she rest, but she shook her head. "We must be ready," she said, straightening her shoulders. "Every detail matters." The next morning dawned clear and cool. They packed the documents carefully in Luis's oiled saddlebags, protecting them from dust and damp. Abby changed into her best dress, plain black wool that spoke of her Amish roots. Luis wore his good suit, the one he'd married her in, now carefully brushed and pressed. Henry rode behind them on his pinto pony, the morning sun catching the silver conchos on his saddle. The road to town stretched long before them, but they rode with purpose, their shadows pointing the way forward like God's own finger. The church family who had offered lodging welcomed them warmly. Sister Martha embraced Abby, whispering encouragement, while Brother Thomas helped Luis stable the horses. Henry disappeared to the barn with the family's sons, finding comfort in their easy acceptance. That evening, they spread their documents on the dining room table one last time, reviewing every detail. Sister Martha brought them coffee and pie, clucking sympathetically at their task, but adding her own memories of the old land grants. When the others had gone to bed, Abby lay awake in the spare room, listening to the unfamiliar creaks of the house. Her heart raced between fear and faith, remembering other nights she had faced judgment. But this time was different. She wasn't alone. Through the thin walls, she heard Luis's boots on the porch boards. He had been restless too, finally stepping outside to walk beneath the stars. She imagined him out there, his face turned skyward, asking the same questions that filled her own heart. Had God led them to this moment? Had mercy brought them together, not just for comfort, but for justice? The answers seemed written in the very way their lives had woven together. Her skill with records matching his knowledge of the land, Henry's understanding of both worlds bridging old divisions. When morning came, Abby plaited her hair with steady hands and pinned her prayer cap in place. Luis straightened his tie, the simple black silk lying smooth against his clean shirt. Henry had polished his boots until they shone. They gathered in prayer before breakfast, heads bowed together while Brother Thomas asked for wisdom and strength. When they raised their faces, Abby saw the same resolution in Luis's eyes that she felt in her own heart. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Sister Martha pressed a package of sandwiches into Abby's hands as they prepared to leave for the courthouse. "For strength," she said with a knowing smile. "The Lord feeds his people in body and spirit." Standing in the fresh morning air, Luis turned to Abby and Henry. Words weren't needed. Their months together had taught them to read each other's hearts. In Luis's straight shoulders, Abby saw the dignity that had first drawn her to him. In Henry's clear gaze, she saw the future they were fighting for. They would not falter. The truth of their claim, like the truth of their growing love, would light the way forward. Together, they stepped onto the street, ready to face whatever the day might bring. The courthouse loomed ahead, its windows catching the morning sun like watching eyes. But Abby felt no fear now, only certainty that God had prepared them for this moment. Luis walked beside her, his steps matching hers, while Henry followed close behind carrying their precious documents. The truth would speak, and they would be its voice. The courthouse steps gleamed white in the morning sun as townspeople filed inside, their boots echoing on the wooden floors. Abby smoothed her plain black dress with trembling hands, feeling the weight of curious stares. Luis stood beside her, straight-backed in his good suit, while Henry carried their carefully organized documents. The courtroom filled quickly. Ranchers and merchants crowded the wooden benches, their whispers rising like wind through prairie grass. Near the front, the railroad's lawyer, Mr. Clayton Reeves, sat with his polished boots crossed at the ankle, a smile playing at his lips as if enjoying a private joke. Judge Horace Braddock swept in, his black robes billowing. His gaze swept the room, pausing briefly on Abby with the same mocking gleam she remembered from the wife raffle weeks before. The memory stung, but she lifted her chin, drawing strength from Louise's solid presence beside her. "Court is now in session," the bailiff called out. "The matter of Boone versus Western Railroad Company regarding water and grazing rights." Louise rose when called, his voice steady as he began presenting their case. He spoke of his late wife's family's long history on the land, of cattle drives and careful stewardship through drought and plenty. But when he mentioned the railroad's questionable deed, Judge Horace's expression grew dismissive. "Mr. Boone," the judge interrupted, "surely you understand that progress requires sacrifice. The railroad's authority dash." "If it please the court," Abby said, standing before she could lose her nerve. The room fell silent at her clear voice. "I have evidence regarding the legal standing of these lands." Judge Horace's eyebrows rose. "The former Miss Yoder, is it not? Come to speak on matters of law?" A few snickers rippled through the crowd, but Abby kept her eyes on the judge. "I have studied the documents carefully, Your Honor. The railroad's claim cannot be valid without considering prior treaties." She stepped forward, opening the first ledger with steady hands. Her voice grew stronger as she began citing dates and terms, explaining how each document built upon earlier agreements. The laughter died away as she spoke, replaced by attentive silence. "These lands," she continued, "were granted specific protections under the Treaty of 1862. Any transfer of rights requires federal approval and consultation with tribal authorities." She glanced at Elder Chano, who sat quietly in the back row, his weathered face serene. The railroad lawyer stood, adjusting his vest. "Your Honor, these old papers hardly supersede modern progress. The woman clearly doesn't understand." "The woman understands very well," Elder Chano's voice carried from the back of the room. He rose with dignity, his silver hair catching the light from the high windows. "I am here to confirm every word she speaks." Judge Horace shifted in his seat as Elder Chano approached the front. The Apache elder's presence commanded respect, even from those who might have dismissed his words elsewhere. "I remember when these treaties were signed," Chano said. "I was a young man then, but I learned our people's rights by heart. The railroad cannot simply take what was promised to others." Murmurs swept through the courtroom. The railroad lawyer's smile had vanished, replaced by a tight-lipped frown as he shuffled through his papers. "These are serious allegations," Judge Horace said slowly, his earlier mockery fading as he examined the documents Abby had presented. "The treaties do appear to require additional steps before any transfer of rights." "Your Honor," the railroad lawyer protested, "surely you won't let these country folk delay progress with ancient grievances?" But something had shifted in the room. Where once there had been dismissive looks and sneers, now Abby saw thoughtful faces, nodding heads. Even those who had laughed at her weeks before were listening intently. Judge Horace cleared his throat. "Much as it pains me to delay progress," he said, glancing at the railroad lawyer, "I cannot ignore valid legal concerns. This case clearly requires further examination. I am ordering a delay of final judgment until all documents can be properly verified." Relief washed over Abby like a cool breeze. Louise's hand found hers, squeezing gently. In the back of the room, Henry's grin shone bright as sunshine. "Court will reconvene in 2 weeks' time," Judge Horace announced, bringing down his gavel, "during which period no actions may be taken against the Boone Ranch's water or grazing rights." The crowd rose, buzzing with conversation. As Abby gathered their documents, she noticed people looking at her differently, with respect rather than ridicule. Several nodded as they passed, and Sister Martha from the church beamed proudly. The ride home was quiet, each lost in thought as their horses picked their way along the familiar trail. The setting sun painted the prairie gold, touching every blade of grass with light. When they finally reached the ranch, the evening air had grown cool. and purple shadows stretched long across the yard. Henry took care of the horses while Louise and Abby went inside. She moved automatically to the stove, reaching for the coffee pot, but her hands were shaking now that the tension had broken. "Let me," Louise said softly, taking the pot from her. She sank into a kitchen chair, suddenly exhausted. They ate a simple supper of bread and stew left warming on the back of the stove. Henry joined them, and for a while, only the clink of spoons broke the silence. But it was a good silence, full of shared victory and relief. Finally, Louise set down his spoon and looked at Abby. His eyes were warm in the lamplight. "You were the bravest person in that courtroom today," he said quietly. "I've never seen anything like it." Abby felt her cheeks warm. "I only spoke the truth." "Truth needs a strong voice," and Henry added, smiling at her across the table. "You showed them all what that means." Outside, a whippoorwill called into the gathering dark. Inside, the lamp cast a gentle glow over the three of them, united now in more than just necessity. Abby bowed her head in silent prayer, thankful for this family she had found and the strength they gave each other. Louise reached across the table and took her hand. No words were needed. The simple gesture said everything about how far they had come from that first day at the courthouse, where once there had been mockery, now there was respect. Where there had been loneliness, now there was love growing steady as prairie grass after rain. They sat together in the peaceful evening, their hearts full of quiet triumph and the knowledge that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The morning after the hearing dawned crisp and clear, but peace proved short-lived at the Boone Ranch. Railroad men, bristling from their courtroom setback, began appearing like wolves at the edges of the property. They drove cattle away from watering spots, left gates hanging open, and made their presence known with threatening glares from horseback. Louise discovered the first act of sabotage at sunrise, a section of fence torn down, allowing a dozen head of cattle to wander onto the road. He stood in the pink morning light, hands clenched around his hat, watching as Henry rode out to gather the scattered animals. "Those railroad men did this," he said grimly when Abby brought him coffee. "Clear as day, those posts were cut clean through." Abby touched his arm gently. "The law is with us now," she reminded him. "We must not give them reason to claim we broke the peace." Louise nodded slowly, though she could see the muscle working in his jaw. They watched together as Henry skillfully herded the cattle back through the gap, his slight figure steady in the saddle despite his youth. Days fell into a tense pattern. Each morning brought new provocations. More fences down, cattle scattered, water troughs overturned. Louise worked from sunrise to sunset repairing damage, dark circles growing under his eyes. Henry proved invaluable, riding the boundaries daily, quick to spot trouble and fix what he could. Abby kept the household running, making sure hot meals were ready when the men came in exhausted. She preserved summer vegetables for winter, mended clothes torn during fence repairs, and maintained careful records of every incident of sabotage. But the strain began to show in her drawn face and trembling hands. One particularly difficult evening, after Louise and Henry had spent hours searching for missing cattle in a thunderstorm, Abby set out bowls of hot stew with hands that shook. The men were soaked to the skin, their faces grim. "Found most of them driven clear over to Sawyer's Creek," Henry reported quietly. "Took hours to bring them back." Louise said nothing, just stared into his bowl, rain still dripping from his hair. Abby tried to pour coffee but fumbled the pot. Hot liquid splashed across the table, and suddenly the weight of everything, the constant harassment, the uncertainty, the fear, came crashing down. She sank into her chair and burst into tears. "I'm sorry," she gasped, covering her face. "I'm so sorry. I can't bear seeing you both so worn down. What if we lose everything? What if Dash?" She felt strong hands clasp hers, pulling them gently from her face. Louise knelt beside her chair, his eyes intense in his weathered face. "Listen to me," he said softly. "Before you came, this place was just land and buildings, empty rooms, silent meals. But you..." He paused, struggling for words. "You brought life back here, made it a home again. Whatever happens with the railroad, that gift is worth more than all the cattle and water rights in Colorado." Henry moved to stand beside them, placing one hand on Abby's shoulder. "He's right," the boy said. You made us a family." Abby looked up at them through tears, Louise still holding her hands, Henry's quiet presence beside them, and felt love wash through her like a cleansing rain. "Shall we pray together?" she whispered. They bowed their heads as she spoke words of gratitude and hope, their hands linked in the lamplight. When the prayer ended, the kitchen felt warmer somehow, as if their shared faith had kindled a fire no railroad men could extinguish. That night, after Henry had gone to bed and Abby had retired to her room, Louise sat alone by the dying fire. He could hear Abby's soft breathing through the partially open door, a sound that had become as familiar as his own heartbeat. The lamplight cast gentle shadows across her sleeping face, and Louise felt something shift inside him, a recognition of truth he'd been moving toward since that first day at the courthouse. He loved her, not from obligation or gratitude or necessity, but truly, deeply, with a tenderness that surprised him with its strength. He watched her sleep, remembering how she had stood tall in the courtroom, how she handled daily crises with quiet grace, how she had turned his silent house into a home filled with prayer and purpose. The railroad might take their shear, their grazing rights, even the ranch itself, but they could never take this precious gift of family born from what had started as mere convenience. The next morning brought more trouble. Someone had scattered salt blocks meant for the cattle, sending them wandering in search of the taste. But Louise faced the day with renewed strength, Abby's breakfast prayer still warming his heart. Henry rode out early to check fences, his shoulders straighter, pride evident in his bearing. "We'll mend what's broken," Abby said firmly, handing Louise his lunch pail. "God sees our struggle." Louise caught her hand before she could turn away. "Thank you," he said simply, but his eyes held volumes more. A blush colored Abby's cheeks as she squeezed his fingers. "Be careful out there." The days continued their pattern of harassment and repair, but something had shifted in the household. Where before there had been grim endurance, now there was quiet determination backed by deepening bonds of love. Henry worked alongside Louise with increasing confidence, learning to read the land and weather like his uncle. Abby's prayers grew stronger, her voice carrying clearly in the evening air, as she asked for protection and wisdom. When railroad men rode past, watching with hard eyes, the family stood together on the porch, unafraid. Louise would place his hand on Henry's shoulder while Abby hummed hymns, presenting a united front that seemed to disturb their watchers, more than any show of force could have done. One evening, after a day spent repairing yet another broken fence, Louise found Abby in the kitchen, kneading bread with swift, sure movements. The familiar sight, her strong hands working the dough, her face peaceful in concentration, filled him with such tenderness he had to steady himself against the doorframe. "Need any help?" he asked, his voice rougher than usual. She looked up, flour dusting her cheek, and smiled. "You could check the stove, I think it needs more wood." He added logs to the fire, stealing glances at her as she shaped the dough into loaves. The kitchen was warm and fragrant with yeast and coffee, and somewhere in the house he could hear Henry whistling as he did his evening chores. "Remember that first night you came here?" Louise asked suddenly. "How quiet everything was." Abby nodded, sliding the bread pans onto the warming shelf. "I was so frightened," she admitted. "I didn't know if I'd made the right choice coming with you." "And now?" She turned to face him, wiping her hands on her apron. "Now I know it was God's plan all along. Even the hard parts, especially the hard parts. They've shown us what we can be together." Louise stepped closer, drawn by the quiet conviction in her voice. "You've given me back my faith," he said softly. "In God, in family, in..." He hesitated, then added, "in love." Abby's eyes widened, but before she could respond, Henry burst through the door, breathless with excitement. "Uncle Louise, Miss Abby, come quick, the wild mare is back and she's brought her foal to the spring." They hurried outside together where the sunset painted the sky in brilliant strokes of pink and gold. Near the spring, just visible in the fading light, stood a beautiful black mare and her dainty foal, drinking fearlessly from water that was, for now at least, still theirs to share. The sun had barely crested the eastern hills when hoofbeats thundered across the yard. Louis stepped onto the porch, rifle ready, but lowered it when he recognized the church deacon's son waving an envelope. "Judge's ruling," the young man called out, practically falling from his horse in excitement. Abby and Henry rushed outside as Luis broke the seal with trembling fingers. His voice shook as he read aloud, "By authority of this court, the treaty rights are hereby upheld, and all claims by the railroad company are denied." "Praise God," Abby cried out, tears streaming down her face. She grabbed Luis's hands, both of them trembling with relief. Henry let out a whoop that echoed across the valley, then leaped onto his horse bareback. He galloped across the pasture, shouting his joy to the morning sky. As word spread, neighbors began arriving. The same folks who had once whispered and laughed now brought food and congratulations. The kitchen filled with warmth and chatter. Someone produced a fiddle, and hymns mixed with frontier tunes. "My wife," Luis announced proudly to each new arrival, his arm around Abby's waist. The words silenced any lingering mockery. Abby watched their guests' faces change from awkward politeness to genuine respect. As twilight painted the sky purple, Abby stood in the doorway of their home, where once silence had ruled. Now laughter and love filled every corner. She closed her eyes in gratitude, knowing at last she truly belonged. The days flowed like the creek, steady and sure. Luis and Henry worked side by side, mending broken fences while Abby kept the house humming with warmth. The cattle, once thin, began filling out on the sweet grass near the protected water. In the evenings, lamplight spilled across the kitchen table as Abby opened her mother's hymnal. Henry, his dark eyes eager, traced the words with his finger while she guided him through each verse. Luis, boots crossed at the ankles, listened with quiet pride as his nephew's voice grew stronger with each lesson. That Sunday, stepping into the white-painted church, Abby noticed the difference immediately. Gone were the sideways glances and cruel whispers. Mrs. Peterson, who had once turned away, now asked eagerly about Abby's pickle recipe. 3 other women crowded close, wanting to know her secrets for preserving peaches. After the service, Pastor Matthews stopped them at the door. "You fought with dignity," he said warmly, "with truth instead of fists. That's real courage." Luis's arms settled across Abby's shoulders, gentle but firm. Her heart swelled at this first public gesture of affection. That evening, their prayers at the supper table rang with gratitude. Henry's voice joined theirs, strong and sure. The lamp cast golden light on their faces as laughter echoed through the once silent home. Golden leaves danced across the pasture as autumn painted the land in rich amber and rust. The cattle grazed contentedly on late grass, their coats growing thick against the coming cold. The Boone Ranch hummed with life and purpose, each day bringing new blessings to count. One evening, as the sun began its slow descent, Luis, Abby, and Henry gathered on the front porch. The weathered boards creaked beneath their rocking chairs, a homey sound that spoke of peace. The air carried the crisp promise of frost, and chimney smoke curled lazily skyward from neighboring homesteads. Luis cleared his throat, his voice soft but steady. "Abby," he said, reaching for her hand. "That day in town, when I stepped forward, it wasn't pity that moved me." His fingers tightened gently around hers. "I saw something in your eyes, the kind of heart God himself honors. Quiet strength, true faith." Abby's breath caught in her throat. Tears sparkled on her cheeks, catching the last rays of sunlight. She leaned into his shoulder, overcome with joy. Henry watched them from his perch on the porch steps, whittling Forgotten in his hands. A wide grin split his face. "Reckon I finally got the family I always wanted," he declared, his voice full of certainty. A real one. Together they watched the sun sink behind the distant mountains. The sky blazed with color, streams of gold and fire painting the clouds. Evening stars began to peek through the deepening blue above, like diamond chips scattered across velvet. Later, as darkness settled fully over the land, Abby moved through her evening routine, banking the fire with practiced hands. The flames cast dancing shadows on the walls as Henry's clear voice lifted in one of her hymns, the melody sweet and true. Luis's boots crunched on the gravel as he made his final check of the stock. The barn doors closed with a solid thump, and peace settled over the ranch like a warm blanket. The Boone home glowed from within, windows bright against the night. No longer did silence and grief haunt its rooms. Instead, hope filled every corner, and love bloomed like winter roses, precious and strong. Under the vast tapestry of stars, the ranch stood as a testament to faith rewarded, to second chances given and received, to love that grew strongest when tested by trial. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.